The floor is yours.
Can you take the
From my side as well, I'm really glad that the invitation to come here. First of all, I have to apologize for my co-partner in trying to make it to Israel to her health problems. I hope if she watching us over YouTube, Adriana, hi. Her name is Adriana Di Stefano from the University of Catania. I'm from Ljubljana. We are neighboring countries. So, first of all, I would like to say a few words. I came from emergency at the moment. With the heavy rains and snowing, rivers level rivers were so high that they overstepped the boundaries and problems. I know it's not really easy at the moment. We have lack of water. We have abundance of convenience at the moment. So, second one, of course, I was in emergency writing this paper. I overstepped all the limits of time, and I apologize for this, especially to my commentator later on. Have enough time for it. So, our title is Mass Migrations in Public Emergency Narrative, Managing Migration, Governments in Times of Crisis. So, we started from the premise that the institutional law in practice normally deal with wars, civil unrest, natural disasters, and so on, but little attention is paid to other phenomena. And we decided to deal with mass migration as an object of our research. Of course, we may say that public emergencies can trigger mass migration. Topic of discussion such that we reverse the proposition deeper into the circumstances of mass migration causing public emergencies. Our main value basis, the value stand is really much similar to the one that the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Migrants, Prof, declared, explained his writings. I think that first of all, he strongly criticizes the crisis and emergency language, media, in the public discourse, and in politics. And that we don't put enough effort to address the reasons of mass migration. We deal only with consequences of it, not the roots of the problem. And of course, we make too much effort on securitizing the borders, preventing the mobility, and using deterrence measures. Mobility. Of course, we agree that the actual approach to this would be through addressing labor needs, demographical situation in countries, opening up visa opportunities, and of course trying to reduce the market for smugglers and ethical recruiters and so on. And by doing this, we would actually fulfill one of the main arguments that proponents of securitization actually raised by maybe these channels of mobility will actually increase security check and security quality of mobility. So our main topic of our discussion, and will be right now because of the changing situation in presenting the paper, because Adriana is not here. It was, of course, how to address the situation in the last 2 years, when especially Europe faced the enormous spike of migration flows to Europe. Of course, Europe at the moment, at least at the moment, is still not having a lot of pull factors like relative stability and prosperity in our territories. course, for this reason, attract a lot of migrants and refugees due to some push factors in the region and in other continents to Europe. So, even before that, I believe there are many evidences that European countries introduced many containment measures even before the formal crisis or recognition in public of this mass crisis. Example, all the readmission of the agreements, mobility partnerships, the provision of development, externalization of migration management, and so on, already addressed these issues in a very securitization way of understanding in order to alleviate the pressure on external border control, government proceedings, social security system, and the states. Of course, that really changed in 2015, approximately at the same time as Matthias explained on the issues of France, terrorism attacks, and so on. Mass movements started mainly because of the Syrian crisis, then it slowly penetrated into Europe through so-called Balkan humanitarian corridors. Story went from people went from Turkey, they went over the Mediterranean Sea to Greece, then they moved through land to Macedonia, Serbia. First they went to Hungary, and then when Hungary closed the border, migrants repositioned themselves to Croatia, Slovenia, my country, and then they wanted to continue to Austria and Germany. So obviously what we see here is the beginning that each of these states has its own legal, practical, factual position on the emergency situation. For example, what we may already claim that really plays a role in determining the scope of the measures and impact of the emergency. That some countries are countries of transit, some of them are countries of nation, some of them are mixed countries. It really depends how much the diaspora is actually already living in one of the countries. What are the perceptions of migrants on their countries as well? And of course, the relative health of in the European Union, especially, that's why a lot of migrants went to north, and of course, their perception of the state. Situation when one of the migrants on the train, Slovenia, said responded to the question of the journalist, saying, I wouldn't like to stay here because you're from a country, which is actually not true, but it's actually an interesting element of this question. For this reason, of course, this project, our paper in, first of all, in determination what mass migration actually is, definition and criteria. Then we discuss mass migrations in public emergency narrative. Then we try to present how this narrative influences the notion of rule of law and respect for human rights, particularly through two case studies. One is Slovenia and one is Italy, our respective home countries. Although we try to include some other examples, especially Hungary, Poland, Greece, Estonia, in regards as well. So, but because the limits of time prevented this, I would just briefly state major findings. With our main proposition was that states cherry pick very utilitarian way. They address only issues they prefer according to their policy. So if we take this more and gross notion of three different approaches to public emergencies, peace, the usual, accommodation, and extra legality, I believe the state really pick anything from this menu. And that was actually proven in our paper as well. But during the definition of mass migration, in ordinary sense, everybody believes, they understand what mass migration means. What we found out is that the notion is used very much tautologically many times, like they use like migration on mass movement, mass influx, without actually giving any more concrete detail to the definition. We still believe that the definition some extent has legal importance because it allows that Ian already said a very important element of judicial control, at least to some extent. We defer to the pressing need of the executive that they are the best people to address what emergency is, and of course the judiciary has limited impact on the control. European terms would say that margin of appreciation is quite high, and for political dream, political questions of dream apply. But still, at least some indicators should be presented in order to rationalize what mass migration could be. I would say that quantitative criterion is obviously the first one that comes to mind, but still, that one raises some topics to discussion. For example, whether this is numbers in absolute terms, numbers in relative terms to the whole population, or is it relevant to address the issue only in terms of whole receiving country, or should we make some regard to the numbers of people living in transit countries, in the country of origin? But anyway, I don't think actually the quantitative criteria suffices. Let's say just give a perspective. Slovenia, more than 500 people traverse Slovenia in a few months. Country of 2 million. Of course, 500,000 people doesn't create such a problem in Germany that has 80 million population. Or if we make another more extreme example is for the situation in Lebanon, where more than 1 million refugees are stationed in your neighboring country. Here, despite the population of 6 million, which is enormous difference between population among the countries. So we propose that there are some other criteria that need to be applied as well. Like functionality criteria, find very important on temporal issues, ancient the attitude of migrants or strategic state, and to some letter kind of the nature of migration. So functionality criteria, I believe, is the most important one because it addresses how the impact of mass migration has on the functioning of the receiving state authorities, on public opinion, of course, on economic activities. And by this, of course, it reveals the true nature and capacity of the receiving state to go to public emergencies. Normally, I wouldn't try to underestimate or overestimate such a criterion, but what we can see, and unfortunately in our view, is that the sliding scale quite often abused to overstate the risk of mass migration on the normal functions of the state. Longevity and sharp increases spike in the magnitude for concentration migration flows to work and rapidly change the resilience of the receiving community to address the adequacy of the situation as well. But that is not just the public opinion of the receiving population, also public opinion among the migrating population as well that may play a role on the general public opinion that at the end of the day results in some kind of migration managing mechanism in the state. What we observed as well is that the nature and position of migration flows can have at least limited impact how the effective state attack on mass migration. For example, if migration flows are from war-torn countries, mass migration narratives are more lenient and more favorable towards acceptance and reception, good reception conditions for those who really need of some aid in comparison to some, let's say, mixed migration flow, and the term has been coined where, of course, other migrants join the refugees in their request to reach Europe. And of course, we notice as well if migrants are coming from geographically rounded areas, of course, that would have some positive impact contrary to the dispersed migration. So, what's probably the pretty much relevant issue in terms of public emergency narrative is whether massive scale of migration is as such a sufficient factor to trigger reactions of state authorities, or should there be some additional element to actually allow some emergency scenarios? And we conclude that the mass migration as such do not have inherent negative value. Example, we addressed the issue to, I don't know if I pronounced it well, it's the Jewish term aliyah. Of course, this is an example of very positive understanding of mass migrations in several ways to Israel. And of course, we have in global terms, we have some, for example, like globally coordinated resettlement programs, especially in China in the 1980s. But of course, from this we conclude that not automatically or a priori mass migrations are considered a negative phenomenon, although we, of course, could see that in the last years, because of the public opinion, of course, this massiveness became related to unwelcome, illegal, irregular type of narratives. So what I think is that, of course, massiveness is a necessary element and found the intensity, but illegality connotes the negativity. But before that, I don't think we should stop here. But we need to address, of course, why mass migrations are treated in a very unfavorable fashion, due to the extent that they provide the use of public emergency measures. Of course, I believe it's the issue of security concerns and by consequence, the introduction of control and punishment. So deterrence, surveillance, these are the main reasons behind addressing mass migration. And I believe the very sad position is that, of course, there is some hidden position that migrants are in inferior position as such. And for this reason, of course, treatment could be different. In this regard, I would again refer to Leviticus 1933 from the Old Testament, of course, where probably you are much better or better with why there should be any different treatment of foreigners and natives. And we all came from the same situation, and of course, we all came from the land of Egypt, and that's the period of argument. But of course, what I'm trying to say that in this regard, Europe is changed. In this control is not just simple control like house arrest and so on, much more complex one, progressing very much with technical measures and border control with drones and so on. There are many scholarship papers already addressing this cross-fertilization of databases, Schengen information system, visa information related to criminal records and so on, and social security databases, on detention measures, hotspots, and again, very informative work for detention centers. What we noticed in this very well explored field within the migration law is that a lot of euphemisms are used for negative measures, and vice versa, very pessimistic words are used for positive migration elements. As you said, so visit not just anymore a search. Here we have hotspots, we have accommodation, legislation for detention. We have it even more because we have a great hotel accommodation used as a term, extremely cynical approach, I would say. Again, then we have to ask ourselves, if migrants or refugees are a threat, of course we cannot perceive it in vacuum or per se. Threats couldn't be assessed per se. We only have to perceive against whom or against what they are perceived as a threat. And so what we are looking for is the legitimacy question. And we noticed that there's a difference between mass migration and other reasons of public emergencies, for example, war, natural emergencies, and so on. Because the latter are easily pinpointed. See that casualty, see destruction of the landscape, and so on. But with mass migration, initially we don't see such a threat. To the contrary, what we claim is that mass migrations are actually, from the migrant perspective, something positive. In principle, why? So migrants tend to integrate to the fabric of the society of the receiving state, and they bring added value to new knowledge, some skills, different cultural patterns and networking, possibility of trade between country borders and country perception. So what we claim here is that when that legitimize or attempt to legitimize the public emergency scenario for mass influence may only be a result of exposed actions or omissions the receiving state. And we try to be informed main societal threats. First one is, of course, the one I already mentioned, proper functioning of state authorities. Then maybe not threats could be negative or hostile reactions from the local community. We address here just very briefly and paradoxically that the gist of the problem stems from the local community, but the negative consequences reach migrants mainly, like with the settlement in detention centers or ghettoization in some reception shelters. Third threat could be, and this one is probably the most visible one, is a real or potential rise in crime in the receiving state. There's an ongoing debate where we notice a lot of divergent statistics on whether crime rate actually has been raised on the consequence of the migration flows. I'm saying they remain the same, but the salience towards this issue expanded enormously. This is again often talk. We notice that media, of course, effectively react to the issue of raises all migrant crimes as very general ones. And the last one, I would say, relates to the societal threat, but it's very fluid one. It relates to the identity, because migrants could pose a threat to the ethnic identity of the community, but this is very fluid. I think it's not a legal one. Of course, we address that threats should not be considered only as the existing one, but of course we have to take into account potential or predicted threats as well. So in this regard, we have to give some grounds to the executive to address even potential risks from the views of risk management. We could use, of course, that even though the possibility of a threat is low, there should be a reaction from the state, from the viewpoint of positive obligation, they do address such an issue. Maybe I should stop here because I don't want to go into it. Although paper you will see how concrete terms how Slovenia tackled and then I can discuss later on how these two approaches are really different ones, to what extent they're similar ones. But our final conclusion was, of course, this cherry picking was confirmed, but we maintain that, especially in the European situation, more regard should be given to solidarity between member states, not only solidarity to migrants, but this interstate solidarity. It completely fails, although there is an obligation, at least of endeavor, to apply solidarity mechanisms in practice. We've seen that, according to the prisoner dilemma, there are a lot of unilateral approaches, which of course produce very suboptimal migration policies and results in Europe. They all had only one goal in mind, deterrence, especially southern countries and of course northern countries as well, to deter migrants outside Europe or not even make them able to reach Europe. And of course the second pillar from which we should start any debate with full respect of the Geneva Convention, which has not been the case in these 2 last years. There are many examples where Geneva Convention has been violated during the crisis. In the case of Slovenia, we have legal grounds to allow such a violation of the future in terms of question.
Thank you, Dr. Zagorc, for this paper and your presentation. I enjoyed the paper very much. What I plan to do today is 2 things. I plan to very briefly explain what I think is the contribution of this paper, and then I think I have some proposals as to how to develop the paper if you indeed intend to do so. If not, that's also okay, of course, but we can also talk about the proposal regardless. So first, it's the paper, as you explained, tries to, as it were, fill a gap in the scholarship on emergencies and claim that emergencies should also, the scholarship on emergencies should also include a more robust account of migration emergencies. And for that purpose, you take on a very kind of a detailed descriptive account of the two case studies, the Italian and the Slovenian case studies. In both, you observe very interesting phenomena, and in my case, I was less familiar with the Slovenian example, and I think in general, perhaps the Slovenian example is less studied at this point, and therefore I think you have some very interesting things to say there, especially as far as the relationships between the different countries in that particular part of Europe have developed with players like Austria and Hungary, as you explained, each having their different kinds of policies and developing their different responses to what came to be known as the refugee crisis since the last 2 years. Now, it's interesting to observe, indeed, that the word crisis is deployed everywhere, and we see the word emergency much less used, and I think that in itself calls for some pause to ask, what is the difference between a crisis and an emergency? Is there a difference? Is there a descriptive? Is there a kind of underlying assumption that differs? And I would venture to say that I think that crisis is much more oriented towards the factual aspect, whereas emergency is much more, as Colleen already kind of indicated, much more oriented towards the normative, doctrinal, and legal instruments that are the response. But having said that, I do not think, and here I kind of shift to my kind of proposals and suggestions for the paper, I do not think that that emergency is as understudied as you seem to suggest that it is. First, I think that since the refugee crisis, we have already some scholarship that regards this as a case of emergency. I'm thinking specifically on a very useful paper by an American scholar named Ginia Ramji-Nugales called Migration Emergencies, and she tries to give a rather comprehensive account of this. And perhaps more importantly, I think that a historical view of the development of the international law considering migrants and refugees shows that emergencies were very much a part, and I dare say a constitutive part of this discipline since it emerged in, I think, which its emergence should be located in the interwar period, even before the 1951 Refugee Convention. What I mean by this is to say that since the interwar period and the Bolshevik Revolution, the first response to migration and refugee flows was indeed in the kind of modality of emergency response. And we see this in the non-sen initiatives, in the League of various initiatives under the broad umbrella of the League of Nations that responded in a kind of particular way to particular flows of refugees, whether they be Russians, Armenians, Poles, various other groups that, specifically Russians and Armenians, who were defined by being a kind of mass migration, precisely in the way that you point to in your paper. Now, as the 1951 Geneva Convention emerged, what happened was that it was in some ways an attempt to kind of move the paradigm, shift the paradigm from a paradigm of emergency that was the predecessor to a paradigm of a rule of law that would first encompass the European continent, and at a later stage, indeed in the 1967 protocol, would gain a global reach. And so we see migration starting from an emergency paradigm and only later reaching the kind of rule of law way that we think of it. We tend to think of it or assume as you do in your paper. And there's interesting discussions at the time, and a classical paper by a Jewish refugee in the United States named Otto Kirchheimer. The paper is called Asylum. And he writes, this 1951 refugee convention that you proposed to legally control the flow of migrants is a very nice idea, but in fact we will see historically, as we will move forward, that every time there will be a mass migration, the law will give way to political discretion. And so emergency is very similar to the relationship between an emergency and the norm here is very similar to the kind of narrative that we are familiar with from theorists of emergency, perhaps starting from Carl Schmitt onwards. In this context, I want to say also that, as you point out in your paper and in your presentation, very interestingly, in the refugee and migration context, emergencies were not always a way of limiting rights. Indeed, I think maybe perhaps differently from, for example, the national security context or the counterterrorism context, emergencies or exceptional responses are oftentimes cast as ways of expanding and granting more providential kind of regard to human need and human suffering than the law would provide for otherwise. And so there's a very different, a very interesting thing to look at in that context. And the examples that you give here of the Jewish Aliyah to Palestine and then Israel, and the Indo-Chinese refugee crisis, and then starting from the 1970s, are indeed enormously useful and can be expanded, I think, in precisely in this regard, precisely in the way that you start to develop them as a model of a different kind of emergency for the migration context. Of course, another kind of iconic example is the Balkans crisis in the 1990s. And there we see the development of what scholars in this field call temporary protection status, or complementary, or subsidiary status. So here we see the kind of growing realization that it becomes very important in the world that we live in today, that the Refugee Convention granting protection to victims of persecution may not be covering the gamut of basic human rights as they start to develop in the 1990s in the post-Cold War world. And there is this idea that we can't, non-refoulement really exceeds, non-refoulement, namely the prohibition of returning someone to a country where they suffer persecution, really exceeds the Refugee Convention and has this added layer of protecting from those prohibitions that are considered, binding in under any circumstances, such as those covered by the Convention Against Torture, and Article 3 in the European context of the European Convention on Human Rights. So I think that as we move forward to the refugee crisis, the migration crisis that we see since 2015, what we have is a normative world in which actually refugee protections per se under the convention are often not granted. People are held in limbo, maybe not returned, but they have all kinds of temporary statuses in various parts of Europe. And indeed, the Refugee Convention itself does allow for certain exceptions for emergency situations. And in that regard, there are several parts of the convention that are drafted in a way that is can be read as quite sensitive to this concern. However, on the other side, the human rights protections, specifically, as I said, those under Article 3, prohibition of torture and inhuman and degrading treatment, are held to be firm under any circumstances and are held to be non-compromising. And so as a normative question, and this coming to a conclusion is really what I would like to encourage you to develop both in your answers to me, perhaps, and maybe in if you develop a paper, is what do we make of this world in which we have very thin and very firm protection of particular rights, and then we, under human rights law, and then we have a refugee law, which is oftentimes not even used, or somehow circumvented in various ways, which is actually more sensitive to conditions of emergency and mass influx, as it is called in this area. So one can take a position that defends this normative condition that we live in right now, but as you yourself suggest in your paper, there's also concerns that arise from the treatment of refugees since 2015, and one might, and some scholars have suggested, for example, that the firm protections under international human rights law are actually kind of to the detriment of the refugees themselves, because they create further incentives for governments in Europe to not allow for people access to begin with, under various measures of externalization, as you describe in your paper. And so, basically, I'll repeat the question in perhaps a more pointed way. What is it that you think should be the relationship between emergency and mass migration? Should there be a way in which mass migration is accounted in an emergency paradigm? And how should that, and what should that look like? Should governments be allowed to exclude people in emergency situations? And here, you point to some of the threats, but I think a major issue is the preservation of democratic governance. So, since at least Michael Walzer, there is this idea that democratic governance is by nature of a limited community of citizens. And I think if there is an emergency here, one question that might be regarded head on is whether mass migration can be an emergency for democratic government. And I think it's a very kind of pressing question today. Lastly, I think your paper is interesting in the way that it shows that 2015, the summer of migration for many people, that was a moment of a ray of hope and lots of volunteer work across Europe for migrants and refugees, was already in and of the same, during the same time, and maybe a little bit earlier even, a moment of emergency. And we see these two aspects of migration emergency, the providential and the catastrophic, kind of going hand in hand from the very outset. And I think that's something that you might want also to highlight and problematize for on all accounts. Thank you.
Any other comments, questions?
It's working. That's why I say it's working. I'm a political scientist, and therefore I have a question which has to do with the very absorption of the immigrants into a country. I consider when an immigrant comes to a new country, he uses the resources of the country in which he came to. Such he uses the infrastructures, services, welfare, health, police, and it has to do with a new load on the country's human sources, and it has to do also with using some financial resources of the absorbing country. Did you think about adding this to your analysis? And another question is about the difference, if at all, between a federal country to a regular country, because in a federal country, the resources are spread. And how does it affect also not only the structure, the infrastructures, but also from a judicial point of view, is there a difference in attitudes or in legislation in kinds of countries? Thank you.
Thank you. Any other? Yeah, Ella.
Thank you. I just like to point out one. I see a major aspect that distinguish between the case of the Israeli Aliyah process was and still going on, and the case that you just noted, the European refugee immigration crisis, is that in our case, not only that it was, I don't think that Israel ever saw Aliyah as a crisis, but as an emergency, and it was and it is encouraged and promoted by the government through all the years, as Israel sees the Aliyah, one of its major functions to be a sanctuary for Jews from all over the world. Okay, so it's different point of view. Thank you.
Just to add clarification, I think it's interesting from the perspective of the rule of law. The two major mass immigration to Israel in recent periods were the mass migration of people from the ex-Soviet Union after the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 90s. About 1 billion people came to Israel, and while the population of Israel was then 5 million people, so it's a very, very high ratio. And the government actually, from a rule of law perspective, did approach this as an emergency. They, for example, the government used emergency avenue to relax planning law in order to construct houses. And then it got to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court struck this down as saying there is no legitimacy on the basis of emergency to do that. Okay, so that's interesting. So emergency the government wanted to claim, but the Supreme Court in this place also to the question of deference in times of emergency. In Israel, the court is not convinced by that. It will intervene even in times of emergency. The second wave of immigration is the 60 or 70,000 African, maybe Sudanese and Eritreans, who came to Israel in recent years. And this was perceived, yes, as unwanted immigration, but the government didn't use emergency. The government passed laws in parliament in order to treat the problem. 3 times the Supreme Court struck down these laws as incompatible with international human rights and Israeli human rights law. But it's interesting that in this sense, the lesson was learned because the government didn't actually use only emergency avenues. That's something about Israeli history. Matthias, last remark, because we are really quite delayed in our schedule.
Thank you very much for your presentation and also for the comment. And one brief question. When you were talking about public emergency narrative, could you please explain me what sources did you use to reconstruct this narrative? So what documents are the basis for your description, for your analysis? And one very last comment to the comment, which I was thinking was very convincing to me. There will be coming up a new edition of the works of Otto Kirchheimer, actually presented by Hubertus Buchstein, who is professor at Greifswald University. The first volume is to appear, I think, this fall, and I think that we'll have to more easily access the works of Otto Kirchheimer, which are very impressive works.
Thank you very much for all the very useful official comments and suggestions. I really like Itamar's response very well. It really fits into my ideas how to continue. So I'll take it for granted. Okay. Probably what I want to say is first what we intended to do in the future. Of course, I have to get the consent from Adriana as well. To make some kind of more horizontal overview of how human rights law issues are dealt with internationally. Maybe because I skip this part, maybe I couldn't already develop, but I see in a way. I see this is the specific difference between the non-cultural at the time, more policy-oriented, how to address mass migration. What is new? Probably maybe only in 2016 and 2017 there were some papers on it. How human rights mechanisms respond to mass migration kinds of emergencies. This is something new, especially in Europe, because we have a much more developed mechanisms of protection of human rights through the European Convention of Human Rights, and also to some extent in the Charter of the European Union on fundamental rights. So obviously these narratives makes a difference between policy responses and rule of law responses. And I would say from the normative point of view, I find any possibility of a migrant and a refugee have access to the court, to address burdening issue, whatever, whether it or she has a legitimate claim or not. So what I'm trying to say that what the judicial protection actually provides is access. But what we've seen is that to some extent the executive tries through deterrence actually to limit completely or completely annihilate access to the court. That's the case in Ljubljana, for example, by arguing that there's no territorial jurisdiction. Italy, then we have in Slovenia, this new Slovenian law, emergency law, quasi-emergency law. Of course, notion that police will actually address all the issues and will return migrants to neighboring countries without any access to the judicial protection. But your question was about my normative view. About how I see emergency in mass migration situation. I believe the piece of ours speak that mass migration is one of the possible grounds to address emergencies or formal declaration, during the formal declaration. And what I would say that there are some specifics to it that maybe need some different approach in terms of judicial control. During democratic government, I will be very brief. Democratic governance, the role of NGOs, I completely agree with you. It should be more expanded. We already addressed the issues in Slovenia and Italy. We have two different narratives in this regard. There's a huge amount of people who are actually involved in either just helping, aiding in practical terms. The people in humanitarian corridors, just making sandwiches, providing basic clothes and so on. And then you have, of course, what we addressed a little bit, the pressure on the policy by NGOs and civil community. They have more specific ways of aiding people in transit. Especially Adriana put a lot of effort to discuss this on the issues of rescues at sea. And of course, how the government now tries to limit this way of civil engagement, which is in a way borderline legal. Because European Union states and Italy having the authority now saying that any help could be considered illegal. Any help real communication with the smuggler in a way. Even though you have a legitimate aim, you shouldn't do it because it's a matter of such. I don't know if I give a little bit what I will try to do. So, turning to your question, where all right? Sorry, I apologize. Okay. Yeah. You gave two notions whether we should include as a societal threat additional burden on services for so social security, police, financial burdens on the national budget. So we already did in a way to the notion of impact on the proper functioning of the state authorities. But still, what we found is extreme demagogy, a lot of, in many cases, extreme demagogy by politicians, conservative, negatively oriented towards any kind of migration. They overstate the amounts that such additional involvement of the state actually provides for migrants. But anyway, I would say it's already, your question is already part of this immigration pattern. Migrants are a threat. At least we should take a look on the other side. In the long run, I believe all migrants are positive. But of course, at the beginning, there are many more burdens for the state, but we have to see the opportunities. Probably we should scale the national context, but at least in Europe, where we have enormous problems with demographics. Obviously, we are not able to procreate through natural way. Versus, when we innovate one of the solutions. I'm not saying whether this is the most, the best one, but at least it is one of the possible approaches is to actually attract migrants coming to Europe. And there are some studies, I believe, Oxford University scholars provide that in the long run, migrations, even illegal ones, have a positive impact on the economy. Of course, probably that could be easier, but also not agree with it. I completely agree with your notion that the structure of the state, or of the political entity, policy entity, of course, influence plays a major role the way how this addressed. And I will just mention, I will not go into detail. There are probably three different types of structures. One is federal state, the next one, the other one is unitary state. And I would say European Union is completely the third one. Although it resembles a federation practice and in the legal setting, it has some elements from the confederation and some supranational entity, and then you have some elements of federational type of decision making. But again, the many elements, nation states retain their competence. If you got migration and asylum law, it's a shared competence between European Union institutions and national institutions. And of course, that brings huge problems. First one is responsibility shifting. EU institutions always say it's a matter of national institutions to address the issue on the territory, on the ground, and of course, public discourse is always about European Union institutions haven't done anything in terms of legislation. So it's of course, it makes a huge problem. In Europe, we address it a little bit through the notion of solidarity, and of course, solidarity has to be done on the European Union level, but by the most important independence of national nation states. I may just briefly address your comment, Ellen. First, I agree. It's not right. I want to say that my starting from math operations may have a neutral value in a way. Okay? It could be related immediately to emergency. I believe idea is difficult example, at least in general terms, but then I was confused by even in these cases there was some kind of an emergency situation, not in terms of formal big scale emergency or emergency security, but some specific field like zoning. I hope I did address something. But I'm really, yeah, I got such a deep talk.
Thank you.